The 28 Days Later saga is continuing with the long-awaited threequel, 28 Years Later, intended to kickstart a new trilogy, but there's only one storyline that the movie can use to justify launching a whole trilogy. A 28 Years Later trilogy was first announced to be in development with original producer Andrew McDonald and former Fox Searchlight boss Peter Rice in January 2024. 28 Days Later director Danny Boyle is on board to direct the first installment in the new trilogy, while franchise creator Alex Garland will write the scripts for all three. It's certainly a daring plan to make not one, but three sequels to one of the most popular zombie franchises of all time. There's almost definitely a strong narrative behind the trilogy, because Boyle and Garland wouldn't have signed on to make 28 Years Later if that wasn't the case. But 28 Days Later and, to a lesser extent, its first sequel, 28 Weeks Later, were both small-scale post-apocalyptic thrillers that focused on individual survivors in a not-so-brave new world. If 28 Years Later is going to justify kicking off a three-part epic, there's only one storyline it can follow. 28 Years Later's new trilogy needs to go global, not stay in London. The plan to make an entire new 28 Years Later trilogy can only be justified by going beyond the series' UK setting and telling a more global story. Both 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later are confined to the UK, but the infection can't just be confined to the UK. If the zombie apocalypse has continued to ravage Britain for more than a quarter of a century, then surely other countries around the world are being affected by it, too. What's going on in zombie-infested Paris, or zombie-infested Tokyo, or the zombie-infested United States? Having just made Civil War, Garland has a deep understanding of what a chaotic, post-disastrous America would look like. Now, he can imagine what the 28 Days Later version of America would look like. If 28 Years Later is planning to start an epic three-part story on the scale of Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings, it needs to expand its scope to show the impact of the zombie virus on the rest of the world. If all three 28 Years Later movies remain stuck in the UK, the series will start to feel stale and repetitive. 28 Years Later going global would risk losing what made the first movie great. Naomi Harris and Megan Burns as Selena and Hannah in 28 Days Later. While it would be exciting for 28 Years Later to go worldwide and explore the effects of the zombie apocalypse on other countries, it would risk losing what made the first movie so great, the Britishness. When 28 Days Later came out, zombie movies were nothing new, but Boyle and Garland brought the genre to a new setting with its portrayal of a deserted London full of zombified Londoners. They set out to bring George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead formula to the UK, tackling the UK's social issues where Romero tackled American issues. It could also ruin the intimate, character-focused feel of the original film. 28 Days Later didn't set out to show the entire scope of the zombie apocalypse, it showed it all through the eyes of Cillian Murphy's survivor character Jim. That refreshing intimacy and small scale would go out the window if 28 Years Later goes overseas to explore other corners of the world. Going global risks turning 28 Years Later into World War Z. 28 Years Later in London would be better than a whole trilogy. Cillian Murphy as Jim in 28 Days Later. Frankly, there's no need for a whole 28 Years Later trilogy. Fans of 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later have been clamoring for a third movie, but no one asked for a third movie, a fourth movie, and a fifth movie all at once. It could be overkill. It would be better for 28 Years Later to maintain its British setting and intimate scale and just tell one great story before seeing if audiences want more. Making a whole trilogy right off the bat might be jumping the gun and putting the cart before the horse. It might seem like a rehash to set 28 Years Later in London, but it would be a totally different story. In 28 Days Later, Boyle and Garland explored the immediate aftermath of the zombie virus outbreak as society was still adjusting to life in a post-apocalyptic world. But in 28 Years Later, they can explore the same zombie apocalypse in the long term, with the notion of a new normal.